Welcome to the book of Abraham Eleazar, the most sought-after alchemical book in the world. This is part 2, where we'll focus on the works of Nicolas Flamel. With advances in modern technology, online research, platforms and blogs, Google Translate and Google Earth, as well as many libraries around the world that are now digitally scanning many ancient works, even the most obscure, we are now able to better translate the original works and the names of people and places. Now, over the centuries, translating various works into different languages has created some errors as to the actual names of people and places. For example, one might see the name of a person of interest spelled in many different ways, which has made it difficult to find some very important people, works, and clues. Oftentimes, names of places have been misconstrued with names of people. One book we'll be referencing here is by Albert Poisson, who lived from 1868 to 1893. He died so early at the age of 24, but was an amazing researcher and alchemist. His works were published in 1891, so just a couple years before his death. Now, what we'll focus on here is his history of alchemy, which includes the history of Flamel, his works, the hieroglyphic figures, his Sommaire philosophique, and includes the letter of Dom Pernety to Abbé Villon. Now, this little addition is important because the original testament of Flamel was written in the margins of a book of Psalms. And although it was in the hands of a Monsieur of St. Marc, it was written in complicated ciphers and was eventually decoded by this Sieur of St. Marc and Pernety. Now, this is the testament that we have today and that many have used in their works, although the original has never been recovered. Now, the other thing that Poisson puts in his book that is really important is a timeline, and it's pretty close. I mean, there's some things we can discuss that may have come before, after, or even some other works of Flamel. But basically, the timeline really gives you a good idea of Flamel's birth, his marriage, when he receives the book, when he starts on the manuscript. Here it says first mutual gifts, which I think has something to do with his foundations or charities. His pilgrimage to Saint-Jacques, Compostela, then his transmutations, more gifts and foundations, and it kind of lists those and his works that he has written and the various houses that he constructs. One of the interesting things is when he gets a visit from Croimsy, and that's in 1400. Now, this Croimsy, there was another later Croimsy who was the official royal printer at the time of Richelieu, who was said to have had the Book of Abraham. This Croimsy was a famous printing family, it became, but at the time of Flamel, there was the previous Croimsies, the father and the grandfather. So it's not surprising that they would have known Flamel because the notaries and the printers were all in the same area there. And Flamel may have used them as a printer or been a friend, but we see that first visit of Croimsy is in 1400. Now, before we begin, we want to talk a little bit about Pernety, who was the wife of Flamel. Wikipedia states that her name may have been spelled different ways. But in other biographies, in Poisson, in the Older Testament books in French, we find various possible last names for Pernell, which might be Letta or Leth. And we do have French names, French last names that are spelled like that, so that very well could be it. And we have a birth date of 1320 and a death date of 1397. Like her husband, she's become famous, and she actually has a street named after her, Rue Pernell. Now, some reports say that she marries Flamel in 1355 or 1368. She's been married before, maybe even once or twice. We don't know if she was a widow or divorced. They remain childless. Nicolas Flamel makes that point. Now, the couple is depicted on the portal of the chapel of St. James of the Boucherie, praying at the feet of St. John. That was constructed in 1389. Now, it also states in Wikipedia, I haven't seen the actual will, that she dies in 1397 and leaves her husband 5,300 tours pounds, which would be quite a lot today. And that they state that this sum was then contested by the court by her sister and brother-in-law, and that the sister won. Now, that sounds strange because we so often hear that the information Flamel passed on about the Book of Abraham and the Philosopher's Stone went to the nephew of his sister-in-law, who was Isabelle Perrier. And we know from Borelli's works that the son was named Colin Perrier, who later became Dr. Perrier, who was a Monsieur of Dubois and Picard. So the name of the nephew was not Dubois. It was a Dr. Perrier, most likely Colin, from Dubois and Picard. The testament that I'll be using for this is a book. It's from a book that was printed in 1806 in London by a very famous printing house, J&E Hodson. And it was privately gifted to the Earl of Ormond and Osprey, which is a Irish royalty, house of royalty, but it's very connected to London, England also. And they state in there that this is a first edition presentation copy from the editor that was privately printed and in a very limited number. And they also state in there that no copy of this book was deposited in the British Museum, which was very uncommon. Now, they state that this book was given to them verbatim by their French correspondent from the actual testament that was decoded by the Monsieur of St. Marc and Pernety in 1760. They also, it looks like it was maybe cut out of a newspaper, but it's a little bit about Flamel. But the interesting part in it is they say that he was a famous medieval palmist, which might have something to do with astrology, or maybe they meant psalmist, that he wrote psalms. So that is very interesting. But this is the copy that I'm going to be using for the testament of Flamel. The original testament that was written in the margins of a psalm book had a key to it which was given to his nephew, and that key has never been found, but these ciphers were decoded by the Monsieur of St. Marc and Dom Pernety in the 1700s. Now, although Flamel purchased the book in 1357 and the testament came later, we're going to use the testament because he does give a good description of the book. You have to remember, though, he never transcribed the book of Abraham literally. So even as he's describing this book and the procedures, he's also coding it at the same time. So let's begin. A gilded book, very old and large, which cost me only the sum of 2 florins, which was about 6 sterling or 8 denarius, formerly, now 10 sterling English. It was not made of paper or parchment, as other books be, but of admirable rinds, as it seemed to me, of young trees. The cover of it was of brass. It was well bound and graven all over with strange kinds of letters, which I take to be Greek characters or some such like. This I know that I could not read them, nor were they either Latin or French letters or words, of which I understand something. But as to the matter which was written within, it was engraved, as I suppose, with an iron pencil or graver, upon the said bark leaves, done admirably well, and in fair and neat Latin letters, and curiously colored. It contained thrice 7 leaves, for so they were numbered in the top of each folio, and every 7th leaf was without any writing, but in place thereof there were several images or figures painted. Upon the 7th leaf was depicted a virgin with 2 serpents swallowing her up. On the 2nd 7th, a serpent crucified. And on the last 7th, a desert or wilderness, in midst whereof was seen many fair fountains, from whence issued out a number of serpents here and there. Upon the first of the leaves was written in capital letters of gold, Abraham the Jew, prince, priest, Levite, astrologer, and philosopher, to the nation of the Jews dispersed by the wrath of God in France, wisheth health. After which words it was filled with many execrations and curses, with this word Maranatha, which was oft repeated, against anyone that should look into it or unfold it, except he was a priest or scribe. The person that sold me this book was ignorant of its worth, as well as I who bought it. I judge it might have been stolen from some of the Jewish nation, or else found where they anciently abode. In the 2nd leaf of the book, he consoled his nation and gave them pious counsel to turn from wickedness and evil ways, but above all to flee from idolatry and to wait in patience for the coming of the Messiah, who, conquering all the kings and potentates of the earth, should reign in glory with his people to eternity. Without doubt, this was a very pious, wise, and understanding man. In the 3rd leaf, and in all the writing that followed, he taught them in plain words the transmutation of metals, to the end that he might help and assist his dispersed people to pay their tributes to the Roman emperors, and some other things not needful here to be repeated. He painted the vessels by the sides or margin of the leaves, and discovered all the colors as they should arise or appear with all the rest of the work. But of the prima materia, or first matter or agent, he spake not so much as one word, but only he told them that in the 4th and 5th leaves he had entirely painted or deciphered it, and depicted or figured it with admirable dexterity and workmanship. Now, Though it was singularly well and materially or intelligibly figured and painted, yet by that could no man ever have been able to understand it without having been well skilled in their Kabbalah, which is a series of old traditions, and also to have well studied their books. The fourth and fifth leaf thereof was without any writing, but full of fair figures, bright and shining, or, as it were, enlightened and very exquisitely depicted. First there was a young man painted with wings at his ankles, having in his hand a caducean rod, writhen about with two serpents, wherewith he stroke upon a helmet covered with its head. This seemed, in my mean apprehension, to be one of the heathen gods, Mercury. Now against him there came running and flying with open wings a great old man with an hourglass fixed upon his head, and a scythe in his hands like death, with which he would, as it were in indignation, have cut off the feet of Mercury. On the other side of the fourth leaf he painted a fair flower on the top of a very high mountain, which was very much shaken with the north wind. Its footstalk was blue, its flowers white and red, and its leaves shining like fine gold. And round about it the dragons and griffins of the north made their nests and habitations. On the fifth leaf was a fair rose tree flowered in the midst of a garden growing up against a hollow oak, at the foot whereof bubbled forth a fountain of pure white water, which ran headlong down into the depths below. Yet it passed through the hands of a great number of people, who digged in the earth, seeking after it, but by reason of their blindness none of them knew it, except a very few who considered its weight. On the last side of the fifth leaf was depicted a king with a falchion, who caused his soldiers to slay before him many infants, the mothers standing by and weeping at the feet of their murderers. These infants' blood, being gathered up by other soldiers, was put into a great vessel, wherein Sol and Luna came to bathe themselves. And because this seemed to represent the destruction of the innocents by Herod, and where I learned the main part of the art in this book, I carved the hieroglyphic figures in their churchyard depicting this procedure. Thus you have that which was contained in the first 5 pages. As for what was in all the rest of the pages, which was in good Latin, I must conceal, lest I offend God, and he sends his plagues and judgments upon me. Now, although Flamel doesn't state it here in his testament, the Book of Abraham clearly points out what the prima materia is, but it's a little too easy. He also goes into many other operations as far as the transmutation of metals, enhancing gemstones, creating pearls, certain weapons, and he has many prophecies for the Jewish nation, which Flamel doesn't talk about at all. Remember, he wrote the Testament much later. In order, after he gets the book and tries for a very long time to work out different procedures and ask for help among all the professionals in the area, maybe he sent off illustrations. He goes on a pilgrimage, supposedly to Saint Jacques de Compostela, When he writes about that in his testament, it is also very allegorical. So we don't know if he went or not. But we know that after he writes that or says he returns, he has figured out exactly what the prima materia is. And he does the first transmutation and the second. And then he begins to carve these hieroglyphic figures into the edifices around Paris, and starts to found churches and hospitals and other things. And in those edifices, in those hieroglyphics, he also adds a little bit more that we can put together before we actually get into the book of Abraham, or we can see it very clearly. And then he writes also some books, his Sommaire Philosophique, and his other book, his other two books. So we'll go into those in part 3, and then eventually into the book of Abraham. So stay tuned.